Back to one of our top stories now, the escalation of rhetoric around Syria and Russia. When the U.S. bombed a Syrian airstrip last Thursday, it didn't do all that much damage, but it swiftly changed the stated goals of the White House and our own government.
We need to move as quickly as possible towards peace and stability in Syria that does not involve Bashar al-Assad.
The Prime Minister is suddenly talking regime change in Syria and implicating Russia in last week's chemical attack. It's all in step with the new line from Washington.
Russia's reaction was not, oh, how horrible. Their initial reaction was, Assad didn't do it. The Syrian government didn't do it.
Donald Trump earned much-needed political cover for seeming to stand up to Russia.
It doesn't get any worse than that.
This weekend, he flexed muscle again, sending warships to the Korean peninsula. Days after North Korea tested another medium-range ballistic missile. Can Bashar al-Assad be removed without Russian cooperation? And is U.S. saber-rattling meant to send a message to other world powers? Well, for answers on this, let's meet our Turning Point panel. In studio, we have Samantha Nutt, founder of War Child Canada. Joining us from Detroit is Saeed Khan, a Middle East historian at Wayne State University, and here in studio as well, senior correspondent Susan Ormiston. She's reported extensively from Russia and the Middle East. Saeed, let's start with you. As we mentioned at the outset, 24 hours after these missile strikes, the planes were taking off from that same Syrian airstrip. Airstrikes were continuing on that same town. What really, in the end, has this changed?
It really hasn't changed much at all. As you rightly said, it was certainly a very surgical attack. It was meant to send a message. But really, there is going to be no follow-through. The only thing that shifted was from chemical weapons to using conventional weapons. The Syrian Air Force has been unrelenting in its attacks. This was more about political posturing, playing to a domestic audience here in the United States, as well as to some degree demonstrating that the United States is more engaged or re-engaged in the region and more globally when it comes to being a policeman.
Sam, I was reading one columnist saying that this smacked of a publicity stunt on behalf of Donald Trump. How do you see it?
Well, I agree with Saeed. I mean, I think that when you look at Donald Trump's history, he is a man who is driven by ratings, and his ratings certainly weren't getting, couldn't have gotten any lower than they were leading up to this. But I don't want to be quite that cynical. Nevertheless, I mean, when you look at it on the face of things, given that his popularity was at risk, and then this played very well to a domestic audience, but his overarching intention, as we know, was to send this message that America is strong and it's back, and he's not going to play by the same rules that his predecessor did.
Susan, what do you see as the impact of this?
I wouldn't minimize the political impact here. Yes, it was posturing, as has been said, but for the first time we're seeing the United States say we're going to punish aggressors like Assad when they do things that we don't like according to our political agenda. And of course sets up Rex Tillerson's visit to Moscow this week. And he said today, and it was quite a bold statement, we rededicate ourselves to holding to account any and all who commit crimes against the innocents anywhere in the world. Yeah. That may haunt the United States in the future. That's a wide, bold statement that they are the moral conscience, which is something that Donald Trump has said for months they aren't.
They aren't, yeah.
So it's no longer America first. If you read that into it, it is we're going to do something about Syria, and it's a quagmire, as we all know.
Sam, as you know, this is the Turning Point panel. Let me ask you, is this a turning point in terms of the Syrian conflict?
Mark, I think it will be a turning point depending on what happens next. I mean, will it end the war? Does it really send the strong message that Trump is claiming? The fact that Assad is back bombing the same village just today, not really. This war has gone on for many years. It's likely to go on for many more unless there is an overwhelming diplomatic response, which I can't see coming as a result of this one particular action. What we don't know, though, is what Assad's going to do next. Will he try to send a message to the United States? Will he use chemical weapons again? What is Russia going to do? Are they going to embolden him in this process? How is Iran going to respond? So there are enough things in play right now that it is, I think, quite dangerous. And if any of those pieces begin to move, then we could be looking at a much wider conflict involving many more players, and that would be a major turning point.
Saeed, how do you see it? Do you see this as a turning point? I mean, Sam raises some great points here. This could usher in a whole different kind of conflict if other people are getting involved, other nations getting involved. But how do you see this? Is this a turning point?
No, I agree with Sam, Mark. I think that in this case, what we have is that Assad is going to feel emboldened. He was able to weather the storm quite effectively. He has been able to confirm that Russia is certainly doubling down on support for him. Iran has been unusually quiet about this, but I think that they're willing to defer to Russia's lead. He's going to play this out for the long game. He doesn't really need to deploy chemical weapons again as long as he's able to have what seems to be free reign when it comes to conventional weapons. And the fact that the United States has not responded since he has continued the use of chemical weapons, I think is quite telling as well.
Well, as you heard in the news today, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has now been talking about regime change. Susan, I want to get your view on this. We asked the question, can there be regime change? Can Bashar al-Assad be forced out of power without Russia's cooperation? I
don't think so. I don't think anybody thinks that Russia won't have a hand to play in the future of Assad. What is developing now, and it is a change, Mark, is the United States administration is trying to figure out where they stand. We heard the UN ambassador saying no peace in Syria with Assad in power. We saw Tillerson backing off that statement today. Why? Because he needs room to maneuver. If that is Russia's red line, if they need Assad there in order to go any further, he can't stop the process right there. But remember too, interesting looking at Moscow on this, Assad in a way embarrassed Putin with this chemical bomb. We don't know whether Russia knew or had a hand in its execution, but remember back in 2013 that Putin promised he could eradicate chemical warfare, and he would help. And he would help get rid of ISIS, but also minimize the chemical warfare. You know, Assad has proven his ally wrong. He's gone against that.
And Rex Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, said that they're incompetent, Russia, because they failed to do
either complicit or incompetent. Again, pretty fiery words and a tough way to start a negotiation tomorrow in Moscow.
Yeah, and that should be interesting as well to see. What do you think, Sam, on this? Will there be a role for Russia if because right now this consensus is growing in the G7 that they want regime change. They're talking about bringing in sanctions against Russia. Is that going to be enough to force regime change?
I don't think so. I mean, I actually think that before this intervention on the part of the Americans, Russia was becoming increasingly, there's a bit of a chill between Russia and Assad. And so I think that there was more momentum for regime change prior to this than there is right now. Now they've got to back their guy in Syria, and there's a lot of pressure around that. And I do think that, to Susan's point, a lot of this is about posturing going into these negotiations. I think that the U.S. is hoping that by playing this strong hand in advance that they'll have a bargaining chip at that table. But Assad stays as long as Russia wants him to stay. And so far, sanctions against Russia, attempted sanctions against Bashar al-Assad, I mean, none of these things have actually moved the dial in terms of getting him out of power. And even articulating what that transition would look like, right? That still is an open question mark.
Interesting, and Susan, you touched on this mixed message that's coming from U.S. foreign policy. Saeed, I want you to handle that one. You explain, as our American guest, what is the end game here for the U.S.? Is it regime change? Is it, or is Tillerson saying this is up to the Syrian people to decide? What is the end game?
Well, it's ironic to go ahead and push this onto the Syrian people when it's not a democracy. And the fact that the opposition has not been successful in bringing about regime change by military means also means that Tillerson really seems to not understand the landscape very well. If there is going to be a situation which may be viable here, that would be a semi-regime change, meaning that the structure of the Syrian government will remain intact, but the individual Assad will be removed. That's something that'll be very interesting to see if the negotiations between Lavrov and Tillerson bear any fruit in that direction. Iran has been a little bit more ambiguous when it talks about its support for Syria and the government to not necessarily put all of its stock in Assad. And similarly, I would suspect that if push came to shove, Putin would be willing to negotiate Assad's removal as long as the basic structure of Syria, the Syrian government, remains in place and allows Russia to consider Syria to be its client state there.
But Russia has to be the driver, and that's the critical point here. And, you know, endgame, the U.S., do they know? I mean, you heard the White House spokesperson today saying that barrel bombs would move the dial, you know, have the U.S. respond militarily, and they had to back up from that.
It sounds like they're making it up on the fly right now.
I think they really are, yeah.
Susan, I wonder, too, how do you think that this is going to play in Russia? You spent a lot of time in Russia. Is there going to be pressure on Putin to support Assad or to back away right now?
I think Russians will support their president. There's no indication that they are backing off the Syrian war. It has made them world leaders. It's made all the path through Syria go through Moscow. There's still support for that. What's stunning in the speed in which this has happened, Mark, is that the warm relations we heard so much about before the inauguration, and I talked to Russians about who wanted a warmer situation between the two countries, that has disappeared. We've now got Tillerson going with an aggressive stance to Moscow, and the Prime Minister Medvedev saying on the weekend, that's it, it's over. We don't trust Trump. So much for better relations.
The bromance is over.
Let the posturing begin,
yeah,
right?
Indeed. Well, and I want to move, Sam, let's talk quickly about North Korea, because we're seeing now the U.S. is moving warships to that region. I'm wondering what you expect to see happening next in that conflict.
Well, I mean, it's actually quite frightening what's happening in North Korea in terms of their expansive nuclear capabilities and acquisition of enriched uranium, for example. They had two nuclear tests just last year, for example. So I think that is a very frightening situation. Surely that this was part of the calculation on Trump's part in terms of what happened in Syria to say, okay, look, it's back. We're not afraid to use military force. That includes some of these other outlying dissidents, including Kim Jong-un. But that is a frightening situation, and it will require cooperation with China. And the extent to which the United States continues to push China to, in many ways, alienate China, to alienate Russia, those are the allies they're going to need if they're going to contain North Korea. So that's something we really need to keep a close eye on.
Saeed, how do you see this? I'm wondering, as the U.S. moves these warships to that region, is this something that will, you know, with its saber rattling, is this going to rattle the nerves of Kim Jong-un?
Well, I think that the deployment of the Carl Vinson battle group there is not just for North Korea. I think it's also to send a slight message to China, given China's expansion into the South China Sea, as well as the creation of so many of these artificial islands. But I want to pick up the point that Sam made with this word ally. I think it's fascinating that the United States has to consider China to be its ally when it comes to North Korea. The fact that the United States has to consider Russia to be its ally when it comes to a negotiated settlement regarding Syria. Gone are the days of American unipolarity, and now it has to concede that it has to make these negotiations. Now, the question is, can Trump go ahead and make these deals? So far, he's been trying to organize himself and to promote himself as a businessman and making deals that way. That is now over. He has to face the facts that he has to approach life and geopolitics as a statesman, and I'm not sure he's made that turn yet.
Do you think he would be prepared to launch missile strikes against North Korea?
He may well want to, but he's going to be tempered by China. He cannot simply go ahead and deploy missiles even if he wanted to.
Okay. Well, obviously, this is one of the biggest stories that's unfolding before us right now, and we'll continue to follow it. Saeed Khan, great to talk to you. Sam Nutt, Susan Ormiston, thanks so much for your time.